In order to discuss the history of various civilizations, it's important that we establish what exactly we mean when we say civilization. And no, not the one where Gandhi tries to nuke you. National Geographic defines civilization by 6 key components: large population centers, monumental architecture and unique art styles, shared communication strategies, a complex division of labor, the division of people into social and economic classes, and systems for administering territories. In a minute, I'd like to address each of these components individually and show how they all presuppose one key ingredient: the existence of agriculture. This is why the rise of civilization follows what we call the agricultural revolution or the Neolithic revolution. Prior to the invention of farming, humans were primarily nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving place to place following herds of game. We don't know exactly what caused the invention of farming, but we can guess a couple contributing factors were probably warming temperatures at the end of the Ice Age, as well as the extinction of certain large game animals that humans had depended upon for food. Now, there are still some hunter-gatherer societies, but the vast majority of humans live in societies that depend on agriculture. Looking back at the components of civilization, first we have large population centers. As an example here, I have Çatalhöyük, a proto-city that existed in what's modern-day Turkey. Large population centers presuppose the abandonment of nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle and the adoption of farming. In order for these population centers to exist, we logically have to be living in one place. If you're constantly on the move, scrounging for resources in one place then another, it's going to be difficult to keep a large amount of people together by virtue of the fact that this area cannot sustain people with resources that just happen to be there. Another thing to consider is that most large population centers that we would call cities are not going to be capable of producing enough food for their population to survive on. It's only with food imported in from the countryside then traded for that these large, dense population centers can exist. Next, monumental architecture and unique art styles. For obvious reasons, nomads are not going to be able to build large buildings just to abandon them when they move on. This requires a farming society living in one place. Think about a lot of the uniqueness of different cultures' art styles. It's rooted in where they live. It's hard to imagine the construction of a Great Zimbabwe in a place where there's no granite. Or can we really imagine Egyptian art like the Last Judgment of Hunefer with all these anthropomorphic gods if the Egyptians didn't know about crocodiles, jackals, ibis, or hippos? Shared communication strategies. Usually a civilization's shared communication strategy is a form of writing. And even where it's not, like in the Inca Empire, it arose primarily from the need to keep track of surplus resources. The world's oldest writing system, cuneiform, was probably invented to keep tally of grain surplus being tributed to the Mesopotamian priest kings. A complex division of labor. Division of labor or specialization is going to be very difficult in a hunter-gatherer society, where usually everyone needs to be focused on getting enough food to survive. Specialization, even in our own time, depends on there being more than enough food available so that not every person needs to focus all their energies on getting food. And we can have people that devote their energies to making pottery or making clothing or blacksmithing, for example. The division of people into social and economic classes. Social stratification requires a variance in the distribution of society's resources. In a hunter-gatherer society, it's going to be difficult for a nomad to possess large stockpiles of resources. He's always on the move, and even if he were able to hunt down a mammoth and keep all the best cuts for himself, pretty soon the mammoth's meat is going to go rotten and it's going to become useless. And for society to have a large surplus, it requires farming so we can have all this surplus grain. And once society has divided up that surplus, now we've got our consistent haves and have-nots. Also, prestige in a civilized society is often tied to what your specialization is. For example, a society might value soldiers, merchants, farmers, depending on where you are. Finally, systems for administering territory. Although Emperor Qin's terracotta army here was meant to protect him in the afterlife, Emperor Qin definitely used his real army to administer his territory and enforce his rule on China. People aren't necessarily going to accept his currency reforms voluntarily. They're definitely not going to want to do backbreaking labor at the Great Wall voluntarily. And I'm pretty sure hundreds of Confucian scholars didn't all bury themselves alive voluntarily. Ultimately, it's force that's required to administer this territory, and an army always fights on its stomach. Large amounts of surplus resources as a result of agriculture are going to be what's required for this sort of projection of force that Emperor Qin was able to accomplish. I hope these examples have made it clear what civilization is and why agriculture is going to be the essential ingredient that's going to kickstart the formation of civilization.